Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, October 30th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the Virginia gubernatorial election. Now, if you've been closely watching this race, you will now know that the Real Clear Politics average and the 538 average both now put the Republican Glenn Youngkin ahead of the Democrat Terry McAuliffe in this hotly contested gubernatorial election. Now, the Republican Party hasn't had much luck in their 2021 elections. They've pretty much failed to win any special elections from the Democratic Party, and while there have been some narrowing ups in terms of the Texas race in which two Republicans made it into the runoff instead of a Democrat and a Republican, in addition to a couple of other races across statewide elections, beyond that point, the Republican Party has yet to have a substantial election. More recently, the California recall election was poised to be potentially the GOP's first opportunity to show their display of discontent with President Biden, to show that the Republican base was energized. Contrary to what they thought would have happened, Gavin Newsom, as the incumbent governor of California, ended up performing better than he did in 2018, which, keep in mind, was a Democratic wave year, with Democrats winning the national average by around 9 points nationwide. So when you take a look at an example like California, you might not expect much for the Republican Party in the state of Virginia, a state that also went to Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election. And for much of this election, you would have been right. Virginia has given Joe Biden the victory with a 10.1% margin back nearly a year ago. In fact, will be a year in just about 3 days. In addition to that, a Republican has not won the state of Virginia on the presidential level since George W. Bush in 2004. He won it by 8 points then, and from that point on, the Democratic Party has won it every single time and will likely win it in the future. Largely circulating around these bigger populations, specifically in what we would call the Northern Virginia region, or NOVA. You can see here on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., this region is driving the state ultimately to the left and continues pushing to the left election after election, thus the state itself moving further and further. Now, when you take a look at this polling averages, this is why you might be surprised. Glenn Youngkin taking the advantage with a 1-point lead according to Real Clear Politics and a 1-point lead according to 538. This is super substantial because never in the entire time of the Virginia gubernatorial race had Glenn Youngkin been above Terry McAuliffe on the overall polling averages. You can see from the beginning of August, when they actually started this average, Terry McAuliffe had leads starting out in this race with a 6-point advantage, expanding to a 7-point advantage. At one point in time, expanding his margin up to 7.8%, according to some polling averages. But you can see now that the average went from beginning off at +6 to being down by a point to Glenn Youngkin. That is a 7-point shift, 6-point shift, depending on what type of willingness you are to average it up. And if you take a look at 538, which actually starts out the average a little bit earlier, you can see that Terry McAuliffe had a 7-point lead at one point in time and an 8-point lead statewide. Now that margin has narrowed down to being down by 1 point. So if you were to change it from then, you would see a 9-point shift in public sentiment from the beginning of August all the way to now. And if you're wondering, yes, this directly correlates with President Biden dropping in terms of overall approval rating. You can see that in the beginning of August, his approval rating was much higher than it is today. He was actually up by about 8 points nationwide. Well, with that 8-point advantage, Terry McAuliffe also was up 8 points. Now, the reason why Virginia isn't swinging so harshly to the right, considering that now Joe Biden is disapproved of by 8 points, that is a 16-point change from the beginning of August until now, you can see that Virginia is a state that voted for Joe Biden, like I said before, by 10.1%, which means there's a little bit more of a room to fall than Democrats do on the national level, in which they won the popular vote by 4.5%. So if you were to compare it to the national average, Virginia is about 5.5% more Democratic than the rest of the nation. But some of these polls are pretty conflicting. You can see here that based off of the Virginia gubernatorial race, it's close for a reason. Not all of the polls seem to add up to an overall advantage for Glenn Youngkin. Fox News, which is an A-rated pollster from 538, puts Glenn Youngkin with an 8-point lead over Terry McAuliffe. Now, just 3 weeks ago, Terry McAuliffe had a 5-point lead according to Fox News. This is a 13-point shift in the matter of 3 weeks. Now, believe me, I am skeptical about the validity of this poll, and I did cover this as my sole poll that I mentioned in the video, I believe, 4 days ago, talking about the advantage for Glenn Youngkin, or maybe 3 days ago, I don't remember entirely, but you can remember that I covered it pretty closely because it was the first time we had seen a notable pollster release a number that was advantageous for Glenn Youngkin, and considering that it was 8 points, it was even more shocking. But then Washington Post, an A-plus rated pollster from 538, released now a more contrarian poll, which shows Terry McAuliffe ahead by 1 point. Emerson College puts it at a tie. Christopher Newport University puts McAuliffe ahead by 1. USA Today puts McAuliffe ahead by 1. Roanoke College from Virginia puts McAuliffe ahead by 1, and Monmouth University does the same. So when you take a look at all of these polls, you have 6 in total that either show a tie or McAuliffe ahead, but you have 1 from Fox News that shows an 8-point advantage for Glenn Youngkin. Because the advantage was so heavy, the overall averages out to a plus 0.6% advantage statewide. But the reason why I would say that the reason why I would say you should trust the Fox News poll is because they have been right in the past. They have sometimes underestimated Democratic support and sometimes overestimated Democratic support. For the case of the 2017 election, they said Ralph Northam would win by 5 points. Ralph Northam ended up winning by 9 points, a 4-point underestimation of Democratic support, which means if you apply that to this one, maybe you can see Glenn Youngkin only win by 4, but it's still a victory for the GOP that they hold and will hold dear to their heart, just primarily because Virginia is a state that they really did not think they were going to be able to win for a significant portion of this election season. But I am very intrigued by the differing numbers that I see on this overall average. Again, 538 is just like Real Clear Politics. They average their polls, and the Fox News one is not the only one that shows Glenn Youngkin ahead, but because the leads are so large, it's enough to skew the average in favor of Glenn Youngkin. For instance, when you take a look at a lot of the data that they are using for the more recent numbers, you can see that Echelon Insights shows Youngkin ahead by 3, and also Coefficient also shows Youngkin ahead by 4. These are BC-rated pollsters, are not valued as much as the Washington Post, Fox News, or Suffolk University, or Christopher Newport University, just because their ratings are a bit lower, but you cannot completely disregard them altogether. So they have a little bit more of a footing to put Youngkin ahead on the overall average than Real Clear Politics does, but it's not to say that, first of all, I'm not trying to insinuate that the average is wrong. I'm just trying to help you understand, why you might see a number of polls show McAuliffe ahead, but one with Youngkin ahead and somehow the averages skew. First of all, it's just based off the numbers, and second of all, you do have to understand that some of these pollsters are a little bit less reputable than the other ones. But for 538, I said they have a bit more of an understanding as to why Youngkin is ahead and can back up their overall average shifting with a little bit more data and a little bit more of the polls that have been released, the ones that Real Clear Politics might not be inclined to include in their overall average. But all in all here, I think that the polling discrepancies will tell us a very interesting result by Election Day, because the polls could actually be wrong, in this case underestimating Democratic support as they were back in 2017. You see, the shift in 2017 went from Ralph Northam expected to win by 3.3% to winning by 8.9%. Now that is a 5.6% shift to the left relative to what the polls predicted back in 2017. A 5.6% shift to the left based off of our new averages would put Terry McAuliffe in the victory spot by nearly 5 points. Actually, exactly by 5 points, meaning he would win the state by a likely margin. Now, we don't expect that. We don't expect that because we see the momentum on the Republican Party side and we see the energy on their side. And now the Republican Party, according to the betting odds, is expected to win this race. You can see over the 90-day average that all of a sudden, in the matter of 2 days, primarily because of this Fox News poll, that the Republican Party now takes the lead according to the betting averages. But the polling data seems to be something that could be very wonky. We don't know exactly how this race is going to go based off this polling data, and it would be wrong to assume that the race is going to be 100% accurate based off of what the polling data says. You sort of could have gotten a better prediction of how the race could have gone back in 2020 when you take a look at the Virginia numbers. Let's go ahead and see if we can find it. When Joe Biden was ahead across the state of Virginia by 11, 12, 11, 15, based off of the recent numbers, based off of what the polling data had suggested about the race. Now, he ended up winning by 10.1%. Disregard that final result spread. That is incorrect by the final margin. But, taking a look at a lot of these numbers here, they pretty much showed Biden ahead by double digits. And you could get an understanding at that point in time that Biden was going to win the state because the lead was so large. And you could tell that it was going to be somewhere around double digits, but you could not pinpoint it perfectly. In fact, the average had it around somewhere around Biden plus 11, 12%. He ended up winning by 10.1%. While that may seem to be a small difference of 1 to 2%, considering that Youngkin and Terry McAuliffe are within less than a point of each other, again, things could go either way. And I think that the Republican Party is probably much happier as they stand now than they were before. But again, this is probably going to be, if they win it, their only major victory of the election cycle. But I do want to point out that there is more at stake than what is simply being talked about in these polling averages between Terry McAuliffe and Glenn Youngkin. In addition to that, we actually have polls that release numbers on the lieutenant governor's race and also the attorney general's race. Now, I want to see if we can go ahead and find that. I do want to talk briefly about the Virginia House of Delegates before we get into that, though, because it does pretty much depend on how these gubernatorial candidates perform. The Virginia House of Delegates hasn't gone to Democratic control since 1999 when it did back in 2019. It went to the Democrats, 55 to 45. The Democratic Party did very well in 2017, going from being in a super minority into nearly the majority. I mean, I kid you not, Republicans had control of 66% of the House of Delegates going into 2017 and left with just 51% of control that was decided ultimately by a coin toss. And I say that being completely true. A coin toss was deciding in terms of the 2017 Virginia House of Delegates majority. And now in 2019, the Virginia House of Delegates went to the Democratic Party and they were able to reclaim control for the first time in 20 years. And now they might just lose it 2 years later. The Republican Party seems to have a lot of energy on their side. In fact, with one of the only few elections held in the 2nd district here in which Jennifer Carroll Foy ran for governor, she ended up coming second in place to Terry McAuliffe. Candy King ended up winning 51.7% of the vote. Now, that's a victory for Democrats. It's a Democratic hold. But back in 2019, when you take a look at that race, Jennifer Carroll Foy won with 61% of the vote. In 2017, she won with 63% of the vote. So when you take a look at that, as an open seat even, in 2017, she was able to win with 63% of the vote. Now that we have an open race, and yes, it was a special election, probably more energy on the Republican side, but that's my main point here. The Republicans ended up getting 48% of the vote, nearly flipped this seat, which would have brought down the majority 54 to 46. But Democrats were able to get lucky enough to win it, but just narrowly. And this is a turning sign of, what might come for the Democrats in the November 2nd election in just 3 days from now. So when I take a look at the results from the previous elections, I also want to point out 2013 briefly as we take a look at the numbers. Again, pretty consistent averages. We rarely ever see conflicting numbers by the time we reach election season because we should have gotten a better understanding of how this race is going to go. But then when you have Fox News and Coefficient and Echelon Insights going a complete opposite direction as Roanoke College, Washington Post, George Mason University, Christopher Newport University, Suffolk University, and Virginia Commonwealth University, when you have a lot of differing numbers, it becomes increasingly more difficult on how to predict the race and makes it a much more competitive race and a much less predictable one, I will say, when it comes down to my side of things and when it comes down to what to expect on election night. I also will say that since I am going to be live streaming Virginia, I do not expect the race to be called pretty early on in the evening unless Glenn Youngkin actually takes away from here or Terry McAuliffe has a surprisingly large victory, which I'm not really expecting either of those two to happen. So expect a long night on Tuesday, and we'll also be covering New Jersey and the Virginia House of Delegates and Lieutenant Governor's race and the Attorney General's race. But I'm trying to go ahead and see if we can find the Lieutenant Governor's race when it comes down to the state of Virginia. The Virginia elections here are very important for just the simple sake of the future of both political parties. You see, if Terry McAuliffe loses this race, it spells out bad news for the Democratic Party in 2021 and 2022. I think that this tells them everything that they need to know, that a state that went to Joe Biden by 10.1% is now seemingly out of reach, at least to an extent. In the Lieutenant Governor's race, you can see here that the Republican has now taken the advantage according to Echelon Insights, but actually a lot of the polls seem to show Hala Ayala with a larger lead than Terry McAuliffe. It seems that voters are a little bit less inclined to vote for a Republican in the Lieutenant Governor's race simply because I don't think this is where they want to make their statement. When you see voters sort of push away from Joe Biden compared to how they voted in the 2020 election, I'm sure they would take a top-of-the-ticket type of candidate in order to push back on Joe Biden. But when it comes down to the Lieutenant Governor's race, I think we might be returning down to a simple partisanship nature, enough so that a state that is seemingly blue would end up voting blue for these Democratic nominees on these parts of the ticket. In addition to that, when you take a look at the numbers for the Attorney General's race, another competitive race, it seems that the Republicans have taken the lead. But again, looking at some of these leads, the same polls that show Terry McAuliffe ahead by just 1 point have the Democratic nominee for Attorney General ahead by 5 or sometimes 6 points across the state. The margins are different here in the Attorney General's race and the Lieutenant Governor's race than they are on the Virginia gubernatorial statewide level. And I think that that is a very telling sign that voters here might be pushing back against President Joe Biden and the Democratic Party, but are not willing to move all 3 offices towards the GOP. In fact, they may be just inclined to move the most hard-hitting ones and then rely on some of these background Democrats in order to prevent their own personal beliefs on social issues and economic issues from being pushed away. Because I'm sure that many of these voters that have previously voted for Joe Biden that are now open or considering or already have voted for Glenn Youngkin are not doing so because all of a sudden they've had some type of major political realignment. I think much of it is just pushing back on the incumbent president, as we saw back in 2017 with Governor, or not at the time, but with Ralph Northam winning by 9 points in a state that Hillary Clinton only won by 5, with the vice presidential nominee on the ticket being from the state of Virginia, so arguably a lackluster result, ultimately shifting the state about 4 points more to the left than what it was back in 2016 because these voters were pushing away from President Trump, and consequently, the Democrats will do better the same way we can expect this for the GOP in 2021, but it really will come down to the wire. The polling numbers are giving us weird types of understandings and expectations for this race, and it's really hard to predict what the final results will be. That's why I have not released my final prediction and will only do so on Monday once I've become the most comfortable with where the race stands at that point in time. But I can tell you now, this is an extremely difficult race to predict. It's no longer as solid for the Democrats as it was in the past, obviously, and it might end up going to the GOP simply because the momentum, the energy, the enthusiasm seems to be on their side, but the Democratic Party also might get worried about some of these numbers and thus rile up their base and bring them out to vote on Election Day. All we have to do is wait and see, because it will be an extremely interesting election cycle. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2021 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.